The bullet whistled past Julia Owens's ear so close she felt the heat of it, and in that frozen moment of terror, she realized the men chasing her wagon weren't trying to scare her anymore. They were trying to kill her. She snapped the reins harder, urging the horses forward along the narrow mountain trail outside Great Bend, Kansas, though every instinct screamed that going faster on this treacherous path was madness. The wagon wheels bounced over rocks and ruts, threatening to send her careening off the edge into the valley below. Behind her, 3 riders were gaining ground, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. She could hear their horses' hooves pounding against the hard, packed earth, getting closer with each passing second. Julia's hands ached from gripping the leather reins so tightly, and sweat dripped into her eyes despite the cool October air of 1881. She'd been a fool to travel alone from Denver to Kansas, but after her father's death 3 months ago, she had no choice. The deed to his property in Great Bend was in her satchel, along with the last of her money and the only photograph she had of her parents together. Everything she owned in this world was in that bag, or loaded in the back of this wagon. The men had appeared an hour ago, following her at a distance at first. She'd hoped they would pass or lose interest, but then they'd started closing in, their intentions clear when the tallest one had called out what he wanted to do to her. She'd whipped the horses into a gallop then, taking the mountain trail because it was closer to Great Bend, but now she understood her mistake. This path was too dangerous, too isolated, and she was trapped. Another shot rang out, and this time the bullet struck the wooden side of her wagon with a splintering crack. Julia cried out, ducking low, but she couldn't hide and drive at the same time. The trail was narrowing ahead, with steep rock face on one side and a sheer drop on the other. If she didn't slow down, she'd drive right off the edge. If she did slow down, those men would catch her. She chose the cliff. Julia held her breath and kept the horses at full gallop, praying with every fiber of her being. The wagon tilted dangerously as the right wheels hit loose gravel near the edge. For one heart-stopping moment, she felt the entire conveyance shift toward the drop-off, saw rocks tumbling down into the abyss below, heard her own scream mixing with the horses' frightened neighs. Then a rider came out of nowhere, appearing from a rocky outcropping ahead like something from a fever dream. He was on a massive black stallion, and he rode like the devil himself was on his heels, straight toward her. Julia's first thought was that she was finished, that this was another bandit joining the chase, but then she saw him draw his rifle and turn in his saddle, aiming not at her but past her. The crack of his rifle was different from the pistol shots, deeper and more authoritative. One of her pursuers cried out, and when Julia risked a glance back, she saw him clutching his shoulder, his horse veering off the trail. The stranger fired again, deliberately shooting at the ground in front of the other 2 men's horses. The animals reared and bucked, throwing off their riders' aim. "Pull your horses left into the rocks," the stranger shouted to her, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. Now, Julia didn't think, she just obeyed. She hauled on the left rein with all her strength, guiding the panicked horses toward the rocky wall. There was barely room, but the stranger was already there, his horse positioned to block the trail behind her. He fired again and again, not killing but creating enough chaos that the 2 remaining mounted bandits had to fall back, their horses too spooked to advance. "Keep going," he yelled at her. "Quarter-mile ahead, the trail widens and drops down. Wait for me there." Then he was gone, spurring his stallion toward the bandits in a move so audacious that Julia's mind couldn't quite process it. She heard more gunfire, men cursing, horses screaming, but she forced herself to focus on driving. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins, but she managed to keep the horses moving forward. The trail did widen ahead, just as he'd said, opening into a small clearing where the path began its descent toward the valley floor. Julia pulled the horses to a stop and sat there trembling, her whole body shaking with fear and shock. She waited, listening to her own ragged breathing and the frightened snorting of her horses. Minutes passed like hours. She strained her ears for any sound, any indication of what was happening back on that trail. Had the stranger killed those men? Had they killed him? Should she keep running? But she found she couldn't move, couldn't make herself leave without knowing if he was alive or dead. Then she heard hoofbeats, a single horse approaching at a steady pace. Julia's hand moved to the small pistol she kept under the wagon seat, the one her father had taught her to shoot before he'd gotten sick. She wasn't much of a shot, but at close range she might be able to defend herself if she had to. The rider who emerged from the trail wasn't one of the bandits. It was him, the stranger, sitting tall in his saddle despite a tear in his shirt sleeve where blood was seeping through. He rode up to her wagon and stopped, and for the first time Julia got a good look at her rescuer. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably not more than 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes so intensely blue they seemed to glow in the afternoon light. His face was sun-bronzed and angular, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. He wore the practical clothes of a working cattleman, dusty denim and worn leather, with a gun belt slung low on his hips. Everything about him spoke of capability and strength, from the easy way he sat his horse to the calm expression he wore despite having just been in a gunfight. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice was gentler than she expected, concerned rather than demanding. Julia shook her head, then realized she wasn't entirely sure. She looked down at herself, checking for blood or injuries she might not have felt in the heat of the moment. Everything seemed intact. "I don't think so. You are, though, your arm." He glanced at his sleeve as if he'd forgotten about the wound. "Just a graze. I've had worse. Are you traveling alone?" "Yes," she admitted, and saying it out loud made her feel foolish. "I know it was stupid, but I couldn't afford to hire an escort and I had to get to Great Bend. My father's property is there." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding. "You're the Owens' daughter, Julia Owens." She stared at him in surprise. "How do you know my name?" "I'm Zachary Garrett. I work the ranch adjacent to your father's land." "Worked," he corrected himself. "I suppose it's your land now. I heard about Thomas's passing. I'm sorry for your loss." The kindness in his voice, after everything that had just happened, nearly undid her. Julia felt tears prickling at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She'd cried enough over her father's death. She didn't need to fall apart now, especially not in front of this man who just saved her life. "Thank you," she managed. "And thank you for helping me. Those men, they just appeared and started following me, and I didn't know what to do." "You did the right thing, running," Zachary said. "Those were the Carson brothers and their cousin. They're wanted in 3 counties for robbery and worse. You're lucky they were bad shots." "Are they dead?" Julia asked, not sure what answer she wanted to hear. "No. I put a bullet in one's shoulder, and they all scattered once they realized someone was shooting back with better aim. They'll likely head for the hills to lick their wounds. But we should get you off this trail and into town before dark. Can you keep driving, or do you need me to take the reins?" Pride made her want to say she could manage, but Julia was practical enough to recognize her limitations. Her hands were still shaking, and the thought of navigating the descent made her stomach turn. "Could you drive? I don't trust myself not to send us over the edge." Zachary dismounted in one fluid motion and tied his stallion to the back of her wagon. Up close, she could see he was taller than she'd realized, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of someone who worked hard for a living. He climbed up onto the wagon seat beside her, and she slid over to make room, suddenly very aware of how small the space was and how his presence seemed to fill it. He took the reins with capable hands, gentle with the still nervous horses, murmuring soft words she couldn't quite hear until they calmed. Then he set them moving at a careful pace down the winding trail. They rode in silence for a while, Julia trying to gather her scattered thoughts. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. As it was, she just wanted to reach civilization and safety. "I've been maintaining your father's place," Zachary said after a while, breaking the silence. "Making sure squatters didn't move in, keeping the worst of the weather damage repaired. I hope you don't mind. Thomas was a good neighbor and a good man. It seemed like the right thing to do." Julia looked at him in surprise. "You've been taking care of the property for 3 months. It wasn't much trouble. I'm working the adjoining land anyway." He paused, then added, "Your father talked about you often. He was proud of you making your way in Denver." "Making my way," Julia repeated with a bitter laugh. "Is that what he called it? I was working as a seamstress in a dress shop, barely earning enough to pay for a room in a boarding house. Some success." "Honest work is nothing to be ashamed of," Zachary said quietly. "Your father understood that. He knew what it was like to start with nothing and build something." Julia felt the tears threatening again and changed the subject. "What about you? How long have you been in Great Bend?" "3 years. I came from Texas, worked as a ranch hand until I'd saved enough to buy some land of my own. It's not much yet, just 40 acres and a small herd, but it's mine. That matters." She heard the pride in his voice and understood it. Ownership, independence, the ability to stand on your own. Those things mattered in 1881 Kansas, especially for people like them who hadn't been born into wealth or privilege. The trail descended steadily, eventually leveling out as they reached the valley floor. The landscape opened up before them, rolling prairie dotted with cottonwood trees and crossed by a meandering creek. In the distance, Julia could see the buildings of Great Bend, small and scattered but growing as more people moved west in search of opportunity. "We'll reach town in about an hour," Zachary said. "There's a decent hotel, the Kansas House, where you can get a room. Tomorrow I can take you out to see your property if you'd like." "I would appreciate that," Julia said. She hesitated, then added, "I don't know how to repay you for what you did today. You saved my life." Zachary glanced at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. His blue eyes were intense, serious. "I don't want repayment. I did what any decent person would do." "Any decent person would have ridden past and pretended not to see," Julia said bluntly. "You risked your life for a stranger. That's more than decent, that's extraordinary." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, focusing on the horses instead of her. "I knew you were Thomas's daughter. You weren't a stranger, not really." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with something Julia couldn't quite name. She found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, noting the strong line of his profile, the way his hands held the reins with such confidence, the blood still seeping slowly through his torn sleeve. "We need to tend to your arm," she said. "That wound needs cleaning. It can wait until we reach town." "It shouldn't wait. Infection can set in quickly." Julia twisted around to look in the back of her wagon, mentally cataloging what supplies she had. "I have clean cloth and whiskey. We should stop and let me bandage it properly." "Miss Owens, we need to keep moving while there's still light." "It's Julia," she said firmly. "And I'm not asking. You saved my life. The least I can do is make sure you don't lose your arm to infection because you were too stubborn to accept help." The corner of his mouth twitched, something that might have been the start of a smile. "You're as stubborn as your father was. I'll take that as a compliment. Now stop the wagon." Zachary actually did smile then, a brief flash of warmth that transformed his serious face. He pulled the horses to a halt under a stand of cottonwood trees near the creek. "Yes, madam." Julia climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady after the ordeal on the trail, and dug through her belongings until she found her medical supplies. Her father had been sick for a long time before he died, and she'd learned more than she ever wanted to know about caring for wounds and illness. Zachary remained on the wagon seat, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she returned with the cloth, whiskey, and the small jar of salve she'd packed, she gestured for him to remove his shirt. He hesitated, then began unbuttoning the blood-stained garment. Julia told herself to be professional, to think of this as no different from tending her father, but she couldn't help noticing the play of muscles beneath his sun-browned skin as he shrugged out of the shirt. A long scar ran across his ribs on the left side, old and white against his tan, and she wondered what story it told. The bullet wound on his upper arm was exactly as he described, a graze rather than a direct hit, but it was still bleeding and would definitely scar if not properly tended. Julia wet a piece of cloth with whiskey and looked up at him. "This is going to hurt." "I'm aware," Zachary said dryly. She pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the wound. To his credit, he barely flinched, though she saw his jaw tighten. She worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning away the blood and dirt, checking to make sure there were no fragments of fabric or debris in the wound. When she was satisfied it was clean, she applied the healing salve her father's doctor had given her and wrapped the arm in strips of clean cloth. "You're good at this," Zachary observed, watching her tie off the bandage. "I've had practice," Julia said quietly. "My father was ill for almost a year before he passed. I learned to do what needed doing. That must have been hard, caring for him alone. It was worth it to have that time with him, even though watching him fade was the hardest thing I've ever done." She finished with the bandage and stepped back, suddenly aware of how close she'd been standing, how intimate it felt to be here alone with this half-dressed man under the trees. "You can put your shirt back on." Zachary pulled the blood-stained shirt back on and buttoned it, despite the tear and stains. Julia gathered her supplies and returned them to the wagon, using the moment to collect herself. She felt strange, unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with the attack on the trail and everything to do with the man sitting on her wagon. They resumed their journey toward Great Bend, the last of the daylight fading into twilight. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Great Bend was larger than Julia had expected, a real town rather than just a collection of buildings, with proper streets and gas lamps being lit against the night. Zachary drove the wagon directly to the Kansas House Hotel, a two-story wooden structure that looked clean and well-maintained. He helped Julia down from the wagon seat, his hand strong and steady on her waist, and she felt that strange flutter in her chest again. "Wait here while I arrange for someone to watch your wagon and horses," he said. "You don't want to leave your belongings unattended." He was gone before she could protest, disappearing into the stable next to the hotel. Julia stood in the street, suddenly exhausted, the events of the day crashing over her all at once. She'd been attacked, nearly killed, saved by a stranger who turned out to be her father's neighbor, and now she was finally in Great Bend, about to begin whatever came next in her life. Zachary returned with a young, stable hand who began unhitching the horses. "I've paid him to keep an eye on everything tonight. Tomorrow, we can move your belongings to your father's place, or to storage if you prefer." "Thank you," Julia said, meaning it for so much more than just the immediate help. "For everything." They walked into the hotel together, and Zachary spoke with the clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who listened to a very abbreviated version of what had happened on the trail. She clucked sympathetically and immediately promised Julia the best room available, with a hot bath drawn and dinner sent up. "No charge for tonight," the clerk said firmly when Julia tried to protest. "Anyone who survived an encounter with the Carson gang deserves a safe place to rest. Tomorrow we'll work out a reasonable rate if you're staying longer." Julia was too tired to argue. She signed the register, accepted the key, and then turned to Zachary, suddenly unsure what to say. "How did you say goodbye to someone who'd saved your life?" "Thank you again," she began, but he shook his head. "I'll come by in the morning, around 8 if that suits you. We can have breakfast and then I'll take you to see your property." "You don't have to do that. You've already done so much." "I want to," Zachary said simply. "Get some rest, Julia. You're safe now." He tipped his hat to her and walked out into the night, leaving her standing in the hotel lobby with a strange ache in her chest that she couldn't explain. The hot bath was heaven, washing away the dust and fear of the day. Julia soaked until the water grew cool, then dried off and put on her cleanest nightgown. Dinner arrived as promised, a simple but hearty meal of roast chicken and vegetables, and she ate every bite. Then she climbed into bed, expecting to lie awake replaying the day's events, but instead she fell immediately into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of activity in the street below. For a moment she was disoriented, forgetting where she was, then memory returned in a rush. She was in Great Bend. She was safe. And Zachary Garrett would be here at 8 o'clock. Julia dressed quickly in her practical traveling dress, a dark blue cotton that didn't show dust or stains. She braided her long blonde hair and pinned it up, then studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked tired, with shadows under her green eyes, but otherwise presentable. Not that it mattered what she looked like, she told herself firmly. Zachary was just being neighborly, helping her get settled. Nothing more. But she couldn't quite silence the small voice in her head that whispered about the way he'd looked at her, the gentleness in his hands when he'd helped her down from the wagon. She went downstairs at 10 minutes to 8 and found him already waiting in the hotel's small dining room. He'd cleaned up since last night, wearing a fresh shirt and looking well-rested despite having a bandaged arm. When he saw her, he stood, and that small gesture of courtesy made her feel something warm spread through her chest. "Good morning," he said. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Julia admitted. "Thank you for arranging all of this." They sat down to breakfast, and Julia found herself relaxing in his company. Zachary was easy to talk to, asking questions about her life in Denver and listening with genuine interest to her answers. He told her about Great Bend, how it had grown since the railroad came through, how it was becoming a real hub for cattle trade and commerce. "Your father's land is about 5 miles east of town," he explained over coffee. 40 acres with a house, barn, and a good well. "The house needs some work. I won't lie to you about that, but the bones are solid. Thomas built it himself when he first came out here." "What was he planning to do with it?" Julia asked. "He never told me his plans, just said he had land and that I should come join him someday." Zachary's expression grew sad. "I think he was hoping to start a small ranch, maybe run some cattle or horses. But he got sick before he could really get started, and by the time I met him, he knew he wasn't going to recover. He talked about you coming out to claim it, starting fresh." "I think that dream kept him going those last few months." Julia blinked back tears. I should have come sooner. I should have been here with him." "He didn't want you to watch him die," Zachary said gently. "He told me that once. He wanted you to remember him strong and healthy, not wasting away from consumption. That was his choice, Julia, not yours." They finished breakfast in contemplative silence, then walked to the stable to collect Julia's wagon and Zachary's horse. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for riding, and Julia felt her spirits lift as they left town behind and headed into the open prairie. The landscape was different from Denver's mountains but beautiful in its own way, with vast expanses of grass rippling in the wind like a green ocean. They passed a few scattered homesteads, and Zachary pointed out landmarks and explained property boundaries. Julia found herself watching him as much as the scenery, noticing the way he sat his horse with such natural grace, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, always alert, always watchful. "There," he said finally, pointing ahead to where a small rise broke the flatness of the plain. "That's your land." Julia's heart beat faster as they approached. She could see the house now, a simple wooden structure with a porch across the front and a stone chimney on one side. The barn was larger than she expected, sturdy and well-built, with a corral attached. There were a few scraggly trees near the house, and she could see where her father had started a garden plot, now overgrown with weeds. It was small and rough compared to the city she'd left behind. But as they drew closer, Julia felt something unexpected, a sense of rightness, of coming home. Zachary stopped the wagon in front of the house and helped her down. "I've been keeping the worst of the weather out, but there's still work needed. The roof has a few leaks, and some of the windows need replacing." Julia barely heard him. She was walking toward the house as if in a dream, climbing the 3 steps to the porch, pushing open the door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, the main room was dusty but surprisingly spacious, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows letting in plenty of light. There was simple furniture, a table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves that her father must have built himself. She walked through the house slowly, taking in the small bedroom, the kitchen area with its cast iron stove, the back door that led to what would have been the garden. Evidence of her father's presence was everywhere, in the half-finished bookshelf, in the carefully chinked walls, in the sturdy craftsmanship of everything he'd built. "He made this for me," she said when Zachary joined her in the kitchen. "He built all of this knowing I might come." "He had faith you would," Zachary said. "Even when the sickness got bad, he kept working on the place whenever he had the strength. He wanted it to be ready for you." Julia pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by emotion. Her father had died believing she would claim this place and make something of it, and she would. Somehow she would make this work. She owed him that much. "I want to stay," she said, turning to face Zachary. "Not in town here. This is my home now. Are you sure?" "It's isolated out here, and after what happened yesterday, I'm sure," Julia said firmly. "I won't let fear dictate my life. Besides, you said yourself that those men scattered. They're probably halfway to Colorado by now." Zachary studied her for a long moment, and she had the feeling he was seeing past her determined expression to the uncertainty beneath. But all he said was, "Then we should get you properly moved in. We can bring your belongings from the wagon, and I can help you get the place cleaned up and livable." They worked together all morning, unloading Julia's belongings from the wagon and arranging them in the house. Zachary proved to be surprisingly helpful, moving furniture without being asked, fixing the crooked door, even sweeping out months' worth of accumulated dust. Julia scrubbed surfaces, hung curtains she'd brought from Denver, and tried to make the bare house feel like a home. By afternoon, the place looked remarkably different. Julia's clothing was hung in the bedroom, her few books arranged on her father's shelves, her mother's quilt spread across the bed. The kitchen was stocked with the supplies she'd brought, and Zachary had gotten the stove working, even starting a fire to drive out the chill and dampness. They stood on the porch together, surveying their work, and Julia felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You're welcome," Zachary said. Then, after a pause, "I should head back to my place. I have cattle to check on and work that can't wait, but I'll come by tomorrow if that's all right, just to make sure you're settling in well." "You don't have to keep checking on me," Julia said, even though part of her desperately wanted him to say he would anyway. "I know I don't have to," Zachary said, and something in his voice made her look up at him. His blue eyes were intense, serious. "I want to." "You're alone out here, Julia, and that doesn't sit right with me. Your father would have expected me to look after you, at least until you're established." "Is that the only reason?" The words were out before Julia could stop them, bold and far too revealing. Zachary's expression shifted, something warm and almost vulnerable flickering across his face. "No," he said quietly. "That's not the only reason." Her breath caught. They stood there on the porch, the autumn wind blowing around them, the sun warm on their faces, and Julia felt the world narrow down to just the two of them. This moment, this connection that seemed to have formed between them against all logic and reason. "I should go," Zachary said, but he didn't move. "Yes," Julia agreed, but she didn't want him to. Finally, with what seemed like an effort of will, Zachary stepped back. "I'll see you tomorrow. Keep the doors locked tonight, and if anything worries you, anything at all, you fire 3 shots from that pistol of yours. I'll hear it and come running. Your place is that close, just over that rise." He pointed to the east. "You can't see my house from here, but we're practically neighbors." That knowledge eased something in Julia's chest, the anxiety she'd been trying to ignore about spending her first night alone in this isolated place. "Tomorrow, then," she said. She watched him mount his stallion and ride away, disappearing over the eastern rise, before she went back inside and closed the door. The house felt very quiet and very empty with him gone, but Julia refused to let herself dwell on that. She had work to do, a life to build, and mooning over a man she barely knew, no matter how much he'd done for her, was not going to help. But that night, as she lay in the bed her father had built, in the house he'd constructed with his own hands, Julia found her thoughts returning again and again to Zachary Garrett, to the way he'd appeared like an answer to her prayers on that dangerous trail, to his quiet competence and his unexpected kindness, to the way her heart had beat faster when he'd admitted he wanted to see her again for reasons that had nothing to do with obligation. She barely knew him, she reminded herself. One day of acquaintance, no matter how dramatic, was not enough to build anything real on. But as she drifted off to sleep, Julia couldn't help remembering the warmth in his eyes, the gentle strength of his hands, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she'd found more than just a home in Kansas. True to his word, Zachary appeared the next morning riding up just as Julia was finishing a simple breakfast. She heard his horse and went to the door, telling herself that the rush of pleasure she felt at seeing him was just gratitude, nothing more. "Good morning," he called, dismounting with that easy grace she was beginning to recognize. "I brought you something." He untied a burlap sack from his saddle and brought it to the porch. Inside were fresh eggs, a jar of milk, some bacon wrapped in paper, and a loaf of bread that was still slightly warm. "You didn't have to do this," Julia said, but she was touched by the thoughtfulness. "I figured you might not have had time to get to town for supplies," Zachary said. "And I remembered your wagon needs a new wheel. I noticed yesterday that the left rear one has a crack. It's safe enough for now, but it won't last much longer. I can't afford a new wheel, Julia admitted. Not right away. I need to make my money last until I can figure out how to make this place pay for itself. Zachary frowned, and she could see him thinking. What if we made a deal? I could use some help with my place. I've been trying to do everything myself, and it's more than one person can handle. If you could help me out a few days a week, cooking and mending and such, I'd pay you fair wages. Enough to get you through until spring when you can start your own garden and maybe get some chickens. Pride made Julia want to refuse, but practicality won out. She did need money, and she wasn't too proud to work for it. What about your wife? Wouldn't she mind you bringing in outside help? I'm not married, Zachary said, and was it her imagination, or did he look pleased that she'd asked? Never have been. Too busy building a ranch to think about courting. Then yes, Julia said. I'd be happy to help. When do you want me to start? How about today? You could ride over with me, see the place, and we can figure out what arrangement works best for both of us. Julia agreed, and within the hour they were riding together towards Zachary's property, Julia on one of her wagon horses and Zachary on his stallion. As they crested the rise, she got her first view of his ranch, and she was impressed despite herself. His house was bigger than hers, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and several outbuildings. She could see cattle grazing in a large pasture, and there were several horses in a well-maintained corral. It was clear that Zachary had worked hard to build all of this, and the results showed his dedication and skill. It's wonderful, Julia said honestly as they approached. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. I am, Zachary said simply. It's not much compared to the big ranches up north, but it's mine. Every acre and every board. That means something. He showed her around, pointing out the barn where he kept his horses, the bunkhouse that stood empty because he couldn't yet afford to hire hands, the chicken coop that definitely needed a woman's touch. The house itself was sparsely furnished but clean, with a large kitchen that had clearly been designed by someone who understood cooking, even if they didn't do much of it themselves. My mother's design, Zachary explained when Julia commented on the excellent layout. She helped me plan the house before she and my father headed back to Texas. She always said a good kitchen was the heart of a home. They spent the day working together, Julia cooking a proper meal while Zachary tended to ranch business. She found his pantry well stocked with basics, and she made a hearty stew with dumplings, the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and satisfied after a long day of hard work. When Zachary came in for dinner, his face lit up at the sight and smell of real home cooking. I've been living on beans and hardtack for months, he said, sitting down at the table with obvious anticipation. This is incredible. They ate together, talking easily about ranching and land management and the challenges of making a living in Kansas. Julia was surprised by how much she enjoyed his company, how easy it was to talk to him. He treated her as an equal, listening to her opinions and taking her suggestions seriously, not dismissing her because she was a woman or because she was new to ranching. After dinner, Julia washed dishes while Zachary dried, the two of them working in comfortable silence. It felt domestic and intimate in a way that made Julia's heart beat faster, and she found herself imagining what it might be like to do this every day, to build a life with someone like Zachary Garrett. But she was getting ahead of herself. They'd known each other barely 2 days. These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that led to disappointment and heartbreak. I should head home before it gets dark, Julia said, drying her hands on a towel. Thank you for the work and for dinner. The eggs and bacon, the food you brought this morning. Thank you for the cooking, Zachary said. And for the company. It's nice having someone to talk to. Gets lonely out here sometimes. He rode back with her to her property, insisting it wasn't safe for her to travel alone even such a short distance. As they approached her house, Julia noticed something that made her pull up short. The front door, which she'd carefully closed and locked that morning, was standing ajar. Zachary saw it at the same moment. He held up a hand for her to stay back, then dismounted and drew his gun. He approached the house cautiously, pushing the door fully open with his foot before entering. Julia waited, her heart pounding, until he emerged a few minutes later. "Someone's been here," he said grimly. "The place is torn apart. Looks like they were searching for something." Julia's hands tightened on her reins. "The deed. My father's land deed and the money I have left. I hid them under a loose floorboard in the bedroom." They went inside together, and Julia's heart sank at the sight. Her careful organization from yesterday was destroyed. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped. Her belongings scattered across the floor, even the mattress had been pulled off the bed. But when she checked the loose floorboard she discovered yesterday, her satchel was still there, untouched. "They didn't find it," she said with relief, pulling out the leather bag and checking its contents. The deed, the photograph, and her remaining money were all still there. "This time," Zachary said. "But they'll be back. This was the Carson gang, I'd bet my ranch on it. They must have followed us yesterday, seen where you live. They're not going to give up." Julia felt ice in her veins. "What do I do?" "You come stay with me," Zachary said immediately. "My house is bigger, easier to defend, and they won't expect you to be there. I won't have you staying here alone when there are dangerous men targeting you. I can't impose on you like that. You've already done so much, Julia." Zachary took her shoulders gently, turning her to face him. "This isn't an imposition. Those men are dangerous, and I won't sleep a wink knowing you're here alone and unprotected. Please, let me keep you safe." The earnestness in his voice, the genuine concern in his eyes undid her resistance. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." They gathered what Julia would need for a few days, then locked up the house as best they could, and rode back to Zachary's ranch. He gave her the upstairs bedroom, a pleasant room with a large bed and windows overlooking the pasture. It felt strange being in his house, using his things, but it also felt safe in a way her own place hadn't. That night, Julia lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of Zachary moving around downstairs, checking locks and windows. She should have felt awkward about this arrangement, worried about propriety and her reputation. Instead, she felt grateful and oddly content, knowing he was there, knowing she wasn't alone. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Julia cooked and cleaned and helped with the household chores, while Zachary worked the ranch. He refused to let her go back to her property alone, so they rode over together each morning to check on her place and do any necessary maintenance. So far there had been no further signs of the Carson gang, but Zachary remained vigilant, always armed, always watchful. In the evenings, they would sit on his porch and talk as the sun set. Julia learned about his childhood in Texas, how his father had been a ranch hand who'd saved every penny to buy his own small piece of land, how Zachary had grown up learning to work cattle and break horses. He'd come to Kansas because land was cheaper here, opportunity greater for a young man with more ambition than money. Zachary, in turn, learned about Julia's life, about her mother dying when she was young, about growing up helping her father with his business in Denver, about the long months watching him waste away from consumption, knowing there was nothing she could do to save him. "He wanted me to have a different life," Julia said one evening, watching the stars come out. "That's why he bought this land, why he worked on the house even when he could barely stand. He wanted me to have something solid, something that was mine." "And you will," Zachary said. "This is just a temporary setback. Once we're sure the Carson gang has moved on, you can return to your place and start building the life your father wanted for you. What if they don't move on? What if they keep coming back? Zachary was quiet for a long moment. Then we'll deal with them permanently. I've already sent word to the sheriff about what happened. He's putting together a posse to track them down. One way or another, this will be resolved. Julia wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. She'd already brought so much trouble into his life, disrupted his routine, put him in danger. How long could she reasonably expect him to protect her? As if reading her thoughts, Zachary said, "Stop worrying. I can see it on your face. You're not a burden, Julia. Having you here has been good for me. I'd forgotten what it was like to share meals with someone, to have company in the evening. I'd forgotten how lonely I'd been until you showed up and reminded me what I was missing." His words warmed her, but they also frightened her. Because she was feeling the same way, growing accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice, to the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. She was falling for him, had probably started falling that first day on the dangerous trail, and she had no idea if he felt the same way, or if she was just a responsibility he'd taken on out of guilt and obligation. A week after Julia moved into Zachary's house, word came that the sheriff's posse had tracked down the Carson gang. There had been a shootout near the Colorado border, and all three men were now in custody, awaiting trial. It was safe for Julia to return home. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness at the thought of leaving Zachary's ranch, of going back to her isolated property and her solitary life. But she couldn't stay here forever. It wouldn't be proper, and besides, she had her own work to do, her own life to build. "I'll help you move back tomorrow," Zachary said when they received the news. His voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Thank you," Julia said, matching his tone, "for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. I told you before, I don't want repayment." Zachary stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the porch floor. "I'm going to check on the horses." He walked away before Julia could respond, leaving her sitting alone in the gathering darkness, confused and hurt by his sudden coldness. Had she done something wrong? Said something to offend him? Or was he simply glad to be rid of her, ready to return to his solitary life now that his obligation was fulfilled? Julia went to bed that night with tears on her cheeks, mourning something she'd never actually had. The next morning, Zachary was distant and formal as they loaded her belongings back into her wagon. He barely spoke during the ride to her property, and when they arrived, he helped her unload in silence. Julia tried to make conversation several times, but his monosyllabic responses eventually defeated her, and they worked in uncomfortable quiet. When everything was unloaded and put away, Zachary stood by his horse, clearly ready to leave. "I should get back. I have work to do." "Of course," Julia said, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "Thank you again for everything." He mounted up and looked down at her, and for just a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something raw and painful beneath. "Take care of yourself, Julia." Then he was gone, riding away without looking back, leaving Julia standing alone in front of her house, her heart breaking for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. The days that followed were the loneliest Julia had ever experienced. She threw herself into work, cleaning and repairing and improving her property, but nothing could fill the emptiness that had settled in her chest. She missed Zachary with a physical ache, missed his voice and his presence and the way he'd made her feel safe and valued. She told herself she was being foolish, that she'd known him for barely 2 weeks, that what she was feeling couldn't possibly be real love. But her heart refused to listen to logic. A week passed with no word from Zachary. Julia went into town for supplies and heard from the general store clerk that he'd been seen around, working his ranch, conducting business as usual. He was fine. He simply wasn't coming to see her. Julia returned home that day with her supplies and her broken heart, determined to stop thinking about him, to focus on her own life and her own future. Her father had given her this land, this opportunity. She wouldn't waste it pining for a man who clearly didn't want her. She was in the garden, working on clearing the weeds from her father's abandoned vegetable plot, when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart leaped, hoping against hope that it might be Zachary, but the rider who appeared was a stranger, a well-dressed man on an expensive horse. "Miss Owens." He called, tipping his hat politely. "I'm Robert Morrison from the Kansas Land Development Company. I wonder if I might have a word with you about your property." Julia straightened, wiping dirt from her hands. "What about my property?" Morrison dismounted and approached with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I represent several investors who are very interested in acquiring land in this area. Your 40 acres are particularly well situated, with good water access and proximity to town. We'd like to make you an offer." "The land's not for sale," Julia said immediately. "You haven't heard my offer yet. I'm prepared to give you $2,000, cash money, right now. That's more than fair for 40 acres of undeveloped land." $2,000 was more money than Julia had ever seen in her life. It would let her return to Denver, start over, live comfortably for years. She thought about the hard work ahead of her, the isolation, the struggle to make this land productive. Then she thought about her father, building this house with his own hands, working until the very end to give her something solid and real. She thought about what Zachary had said, that owning land mattered, that it was worth fighting for. "No," Julia said firmly. "This land belonged to my father. He died to give it to me, and I'm not selling." Morrison's smile faded. "Miss Owens, a woman alone cannot successfully work a claim this size. You're going to fail, and then you'll lose the land anyway for unpaid taxes. I'm offering you a graceful way out." I said no. "Please leave." "Think about it," Morrison said, his tone hardening slightly. "I'll be back in a few days for your answer. I hope you'll reconsider." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Julia shaken and angry. She returned to her weeding with renewed determination. She would make this work. She had to. That evening, as the sun was setting, Julia heard another horse approaching. This time it was Zachary, and her heart nearly stopped at the sight of him. He dismounted slowly, his expression uncertain in a way she'd never seen before. "I heard Morrison came to see you," he said without preamble. Half the county heard. He's not subtle about his land-grabbing schemes. "He made me an offer. I refused," Julia said, her voice cool despite the way her heart was racing. "Good. His company has been buying up properties and driving small ranchers out. The land development is just a front. They want to create one massive cattle operation, no matter who gets hurt in the process." "Well, he's not getting my land." "No, he's not." Zachary took a step closer, then stopped as if he wanted to approach but didn't dare. "Julia, I need to apologize. I've been a fool." She waited, not trusting herself to speak. "When you moved back to your place, I told myself it was for the best. You had your land, I had mine, and that week you spent at my ranch was just temporary. But the truth is, every day you were there, I was falling for you. And when you left, it felt like someone had carved out a piece of me. I stayed away because I was scared, because caring about someone means risking heartbreak, and I've spent so long protecting myself that I'd forgotten what it was like to feel anything real." Julia's breath caught. "Zachary, let me finish, please." He took another step closer. "That first day on the trail, when I saw you in danger, something in me just knew, this woman matters. This woman is important. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I love you, Julia. I've been in love with you since you bandaged my arm and told me I was too stubborn for my own good. And I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I had to tell you. I couldn't let Morrison or anyone else come around without you knowing that you're not alone. You'll never be alone again if you don't want to be. Julia felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in weeks, they were happy tears. You stubborn, impossible man. I've been in love with you since you appeared on that trail like some kind of miracle. I've spent the last week miserable because I thought you wanted nothing to do with me. Zachary's face transformed, joy and relief lighting up his features. You love me. Yes, you idiot, I love you. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. Julia went willingly, and when he kissed her, it felt like coming home, like every good thing she'd ever hoped for. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding in, all the fear and loneliness and desperate hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zachary rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. I know it's fast. I know we should probably wait, but I don't want to. I want you in my life permanently. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. Marry me, Julia. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, absolutely yes. He kissed her again, and this time there was promise in it, and passion, and the joy of 2 people who'd found exactly what they needed in each other. They were married 3 weeks later in Great Bend's small church, with half the town in attendance. Julia wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit, and Zachary wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortable in his formality. But when he saw her walking down the aisle, his face lit up with such love and happiness that Julia felt her heart might burst. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Zachary kissed her with such enthusiasm that the congregation broke into laughter and applause. They celebrated with a reception at the hotel, with food and music and dancing that lasted long into the night. As they finally left the party and headed to Zachary's ranch, their ranch now, Julia reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She'd come to Kansas alone and frightened, running from danger, and she'd found not just safety but love, partnership, and a future brighter than anything she'd imagined. Morrison had come back once more to make another offer on her land, and Julia had the satisfaction of introducing him to her new husband and watching his face fall as he realized he'd lost. They decided to keep both properties, combining them into a single 80-acre ranch that gave them room to grow and build something lasting. Their first year of marriage was hard work, but deeply happy. They combined their herds, improved both houses, and started building their ranch into something profitable. Julia discovered she had a knack for managing the business side of ranching, keeping books and negotiating prices, while Zachary's skills with cattle and horses made their livestock operation successful. They worked side by side every day, partners in every sense of the word. There were challenges, of course, droughts and harsh winters and the constant struggle to make ends meet. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. Their first child, a boy they named Thomas after Julia's father, was born in the spring of 1883. Zachary was terrified during the labor, pacing outside the bedroom while the doctor and a neighbor woman attended Julia. When he was finally allowed in to meet his son, his hands shook as he held the tiny bundle, and tears streamed down his face. "He's perfect," Zachary whispered, looking at Julia with such love and awe that she fell in love with him all over again. "You're perfect, thank you." Thomas was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Mary, and then 3 years after that by twin boys, James and Samuel. Their house, expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the organized chaos of a working ranch with 4 young ones underfoot. Julia sometimes thought about that desperate day on the trail, when she'd been certain she was going to die. She thought about how Zachary had appeared like an answer to her prayers, how his courage and skill had saved her life. But more than that, she thought about all the smaller ways he'd saved her every day since, with his love and support, his partnership and friendship, his unwavering faith in her. In turn, she'd given him what he'd needed most, the companionship and love that had transformed his house into a home, his solitary existence into a rich, full life. Her loyalty to him had never wavered from that first day, and what had started as gratitude had grown into a love so deep and abiding that she couldn't imagine life without him. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Julia to the spot where they'd first met, that dangerous trail where everything had begun. It was different now, safer, with the worst of the treacherous sections improved and marked. But standing there, looking at the place where their story started, Julia felt the same flutter in her chest she'd felt that first day. "You ever regret it?" Zachary asked, holding her hand. "Choosing this life, it hasn't been easy." Julia looked at him, this man who'd saved her in every way that mattered, and smiled. "Not for a single second. You gave me everything I needed that day. Safety, certainly, but also hope and a future I never could have imagined. You gave me love, Zachary, real and lasting love. How could I ever regret that?" He pulled her close and kissed her, and Julia thought about how far they'd come from that first terrifying encounter. She'd thanked him with loyalty, stayed true to him through every challenge and triumph. And that loyalty had transformed into the kind of endless, enduring love that songs were written about, the kind that lasted through decades and hardships and all the beautiful, ordinary moments of a life built together. Their ranch continued to prosper over the years. As the children grew, each one took on responsibilities according to their abilities. Thomas, serious and hardworking like his father, showed a natural talent for handling livestock. Mary inherited her mother's head for business and could calculate profit margins faster than anyone. The twins, wild and adventurous, were the best riders on the ranch by the time they were 10. Zachary and Julia watched their children grow with pride, instilling in them the values they'd learned themselves. That honest work mattered, that loyalty and love were worth more than gold, that family was everything. When Thomas turned 18 in 1901, Zachary signed over a portion of their land to him, helping him start his own operation adjacent to theirs. It was the same thing Thomas Owens had tried to do for Julia, passing on a legacy of land and opportunity. The circle completed itself in the most beautiful way. Julia was 53 years old when she stood with Zachary and watched their eldest son marry a sweet-faced girl from town. As the young couple exchanged vows, Julia reached for her husband's hand and found it already reaching for hers, the same instinctive connection they'd had since the beginning. "We did good," Zachary whispered to her. "We did," Julia agreed, looking at their children, their grandchild on the way, the ranch they'd built from nothing. "We did very good." That night, lying in bed in the house that had witnessed so much of their life together, Julia thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd left Denver alone and afraid, traveling toward an uncertain future. She'd faced death on a dangerous trail and been saved by a stranger who became her everything. The gratitude she'd felt that first day had transformed into loyalty, standing by him through every trial and triumph. And that loyalty had blossomed into a love so powerful and true that it had shaped every day of the past 20 years, creating not just a marriage but a partnership, not just a family but a legacy. "What are you thinking about?" Zachary asked, pulling her closer. After all these years, he could still read her moods perfectly. "That day on the trail," Julia said. "How you saved me." "You saved me right back," Zachary said, kissing her forehead. "You just took a little longer to do it. I was drowning in loneliness, and I didn't even know it until you showed me what it meant to truly live, to share life with someone who understood me completely." "I love you," Julia said, the words as true now as they'd been that first time she'd said them 20 years ago. "I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I'll love you the same," Zachary promised, as he'd promised 1,000 times before and would promise 1,000 times more. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, as they had every night for 2 decades. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting from that chance encounter on a dangerous trail. The years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch grew and prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in Kansas. Other families built homes on the surrounding land, and the area that had once been isolated prairie became a thriving community, with Zachary and Julia Garrett at its heart, respected and beloved by all who knew them. When they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1931, the entire county came out for the party. Their children and grandchildren filled the house that had once seemed so large and now felt perfectly sized for the family it contained. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and happy tears, as everyone celebrated the love story that had become legendary in Great Bend. "Tell us again how you met," one of the great-grandchildren begged, and Julia and Zachary exchanged a smile. "Your great-grandmother was in trouble," Zachary began, as he always did, "and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. He saved my life," Julia continued, taking up the familiar story. "And I decided right then that I would spend the rest of mine showing him what that meant to me." "She thanked me with loyalty," Zachary said, squeezing her hand. "The kind that never wavered, not once in 50 years. And that loyalty became love," Julia finished. "The kind of love that lasts forever." Their audience sighed happily, as they always did at this story, and Julia looked around at the faces of her family, the legacy of that dangerous day on the trail. 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren so far, all of them here because she'd been brave enough to travel alone to Kansas, and because Zachary had been brave enough to ride to her rescue. She'd come to the frontier looking for a fresh start, for the property her father had left her, for a chance to build something of her own. She'd found all of that and so much more. She'd found her home, her partner, her purpose, and a love that had sustained her through half a century of challenges and joys. As the party continued around them, Zachary leaned in and whispered in Julia's ear, "I'd do it all again. Every single day. You were worth saving, Julia Garrett." "And you were worth loving," she whispered back. "Worth every moment of loyalty and every day of devotion. You still are." They kissed, these two people who'd loved each other through 50 years of marriage, and their family cheered and clapped, celebrating not just their anniversary but the beautiful example they'd set, the proof that true love existed and could endure. Julia held Zachary's hand and looked out at the ranch they'd built together, the family they'd created, the life they'd shared. She thought about that frightened girl on the trail, running from danger, and the lonely rancher who'd risked everything to save her. She thought about how neither of them could have imagined in that moment of crisis and courage that they were really finding each other, their perfect match, their forever love. The sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the same colors it had been that first evening they'd sat together on the porch and begun to fall in love. Some things changed, but the important things remained constant. Love, loyalty, family, partnership. These were the things that mattered, the things that lasted. And as darkness fell and the party moved inside, Zachary and Julia remained on the porch for a few more moments, holding hands as they'd done for 50 years, grateful for every day they'd been given together, for the dangerous trail that had brought them together, and for the endless love that had kept them together ever since. Their story, born from a moment of terror and rescue, had become something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of gratitude transformed into loyalty, and loyalty transformed into the deepest, truest love. It was a story that would be passed down through generations, inspiring their descendants with its message of courage, faith, and the extraordinary power of two hearts finding each other against all odds. And in the quiet of that anniversary evening, with their family's laughter echoing from inside the house and 50 years of memories surrounding them, Julia and Zachary held each other close and knew they'd been blessed beyond measure. They'd found in each other not just a spouse but a true partner, not just love but an enduring bond that had made every trial bearable and every joy sweeter. The dangerous trail had led them both exactly where they needed to be to each other, to this life, to this moment. And they knew with absolute certainty that they would choose it all over again if given the chance, every single moment, because their love had been worth everything. It had been worth the danger, the struggle, the fear, and the uncertainty. It had been worth it all because it was real and true and absolutely endless, lasting not just through their lifetimes, but echoing forward into all the generations that would follow, carrying forward the legacy of that day when he saved her from a dangerous trail. And she thanked him with loyalty that became endless love.